Just to frame this a little bit, the latest United Nations State of the Global Climate Report, which was released in late March, so just a couple weeks ago, says that heat waves, floods, droughts, wildfires, and rapidly intensifying tropical cyclones are causing misery and mayhem throughout the world, upending everyday life for millions and inflicting many billions of dollars in economic losses. This is from the United Nations report 2 weeks ago. Meanwhile, fossil fuel production, the expansion of fossil fuel infrastructure, and global greenhouse gas emissions continue rising, threatening our best chance of survival through a rapid and just transition off of fossil fuels. The world's fossil fuel producers, for their part, are on track to nearly quadruple the amount of oil extracted and gas from newly approved projects by the end of this decade, with the US leading the way in a surge of activity that threatens to blow apart the agreed-upon climate goals set forth in the Paris Climate Accord. Are folks familiar with the Paris Accord? Right. So that accord said that there can be no oil and gas infrastructure if the planet is to avoid careening past 1.5 degrees Celsius of global heating above pre-industrial times. The International Energy Agency stated that there can be no more fossil fuel projects. This is a concern. This is not us. This is not the movement. The International Energy Agency is a very conservative body. And even they are saying we just simply cannot build new fossil fuel projects. The climate crisis is the defining challenge that humanity faces and is closely intertwined with the inequality crisis, as witnessed by growing food insecurity, population displacement, and biodiversity loss. This was said by Celeste Saulo, the Secretary General of the United Nations World Meteorological Organization. Building an intersectional, people-powered movement to win a just transition off fossil fuels is our best chance to reclaim our right to a healthy, safe, and livable future. Just transition is a vision-led, unifying, and place-based set of principles, processes, and practices that build economic and political power to shift from an extractive economy to a regenerative economy. And this transition itself must be just and equitable. It must redress past harms, create new relationships of power for the future through reparations. If the process is not just, the outcome will never be. So just transition describes both where we're going and how we get there. And all of this leads to organizing. The existential of our crisis of climate change has often been framed about, oh, it's just a matter of technology, right? If we could just switch technologies or just get the right message out to people or the perfect policy solution, that will address the climate crisis. But those are fallacies. Winning the depth and scale of change that's required to reverse the climate crisis requires real people power, and the only source of power available to us is the number of people we can organize to take collective action where we live, where we work, where we go to school, where we pray, and where we play. That's an excerpt from Power Lines, a new book that one of our panelists is featured in. So, for decades, the environmental movement has looked to find shortcuts to building this people power. But there is simply no shortcut. We must build bigger and stronger organizations. We must recruit, develop, and mentor new leaders. We must forge new and broader coalitions that are rooted in trusting relationships and active solidarity, and create a movement culture that is inclusive, intersectional, joyful, and irresistible. So, with that said, we are thrilled to have our panelists. I think we're all here, minus one, but we're going to start with some introductions. And just bear with me one moment here. I do know these folks. I just want to make sure I get their biographies right. So, our first panelist is Dr. Nikki Sheets. Nikki is the director of the Center for the Urban Environment at the John Watson Institute for Urban Policy and Research at Kean University, and has defined the primary mission of the center as providing support for the environmental justice community on both the state and national level. Among the many issues that Dr. Sheets is working on are particulate matter air pollution, climate change, cumulative impacts, developing legal strategies, and increasing the capacity of the environmental justice community to address these and other issues. Dr. Sheets was a founding member of the New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance, the EJ Leadership Forum, I'll use EJ intertwined with environmental justice, the Building Equity and Alignment Initiative, and the Equitable and Just National Climate Platform, as well as the Coalition for Healthy Ports here in New Jersey. He has held leadership positions within these organizations as well as within the Center for Earth, Energy, and Democracy. Let's give it up, and we are so excited to hear from Dr. Nikki Sheets.
All right. Good morning. I thought I was actually going to be the third EJ speaker, but that's cool. I'll be the first one. That's fine. So you're going to hear my colleagues, Cynthia Millon and Brooke Helmet, are going to go into some details about environmental justice and climate change mitigation policy. And we've been doing a lot of detailed work lately concerning the new EPA power plant rule, and we've developed our own climate change mitigation policy. But I want to start off today. I want to do something we haven't done in a while. I want to take a step back and be more general and talk to you generally about what we want. When I say we, I'm talking about the environmental justice grassroots movement, national movement. What we want from climate change mitigation policy from an EJ perspective. And we've brought something unique to the table. What we've said is that climate change mitigation policy should not only fight climate change, but in addition to fighting against climate change, right, it should fight for environmental justice and for equity. So any climate change mitigation policy should not only fight climate change, well, any climate change mitigation policy should have environmental justice and equity incorporated into it up front. And, all right, this is a good crowd. That's the first time I've ever gotten applause when I said that. So it's a good crowd. And the reason for that is because in our society we have disparities, persistent disparities that are rooted in race and income. And part of the reason why those disparities exist is because of the way we've developed and implemented public policy. So if we don't incorporate equity and environmental justice upfront in climate change mitigation policy and develop climate change mitigation policy in a business as usual manner, then there's a high likelihood, we think anyway, that it's going to perpetuate or worst case scenario, even exacerbate those inequalities that exist now in our country that are rooted in race and income. And so from an environmental justice perspective, what we've said is that if a climate change mitigation policy does not do both, then it should not be used. And, that's a fairly profound statement. Because let me talk about that just for a minute. You're going to hear from the panel and later today, you're going to hear a lot of speakers talk about, Matt's already kind of said it. Look, some of the policies that have been put forth now to fight climate change, people don't think are going to work. Right? And you'll hear more about it. We're talking about things like carbon trading, carbon capture and sequestration, CCS, right, and hydrogen co-firing. And so you'll hear a lot of skepticism about those policies. But from an EJ perspective, what we say, and you're going to hear some skepticism from us, but from an EJ perspective, what we say is that even if those policies work in fighting climate change, from an EJ perspective, they still shouldn't be used. Why? Because there's no guarantee that they're going to fight for environmental justice and equity. So here's where I'll get a little bit more detail. What do I mean in practical terms by fighting for environmental justice and equity in the context of climate change mitigation policy? Well, look, when you fight against climate change, you're normally talking about reducing greenhouse gas emissions, carbon dioxide emissions, right? The way we've defined equity and environmental justice in this context is that we want climate change mitigation policy not only to reduce carbon dioxide emissions, but also to reduce emissions of other air pollutants that are emitted along with the carbon dioxide. Air pollutants like fine particulate matter. Go ahead, I like the clapping. I said I've never gotten clapping when I say it. Local air pollutants like fine particulate matter, sulfur dioxide, and nitrogen oxides. Because it's these pollutants that are contributing to disproportionate pollution load in environmental justice communities. When I say environmental justice communities, I mean communities of color and communities with low income. And remember, that's the central issue in environmental justice. Environmental justice has been defined, very expansively now. We talk about climate justice, we talk about transportation justice, we talk about food justice, and all those are parts of environmental justice. But the core issue is still, I would argue, that we have too much pollution in communities of color and low-income communities. And go back to disparities. One type of disparity we have in our country is health disparities. People in black and brown communities have more illness, they have higher death rates, and our lifespans are not as long. And one reason that happens is because we have disproportionate pollution in our communities. That's not the only reason, but that's one reason. So that's the reason why we want climate change mitigation policy, not only to reduce carbon dioxide emissions, but these other emissions to improve the health of EJ communities. We have a chance here, we have an opportunity. While there is, Republicans don't believe this, but there is some political will to fight climate change. So while that political will exists, let's not only fight climate change, but let's make a more equitable society and fight for environmental justice as we fight for climate change. Because if we don't, I want to remind you of something. If children in black and brown neighborhoods, or adults, or old people like me, if we're killed by local air pollution, when we win the fight against climate change, and I think we will win the fight, wow, that's a lot better. I think we will win the fight against climate change, right? The people that have been killed because of local air pollution, they're not going to be resurrected. If you're killed by air pollution, you're going to be just as dead as if you're killed by climate change. So we have an opportunity to save those people. And that's why when we talk about policies like CCS and hydrogen co-firing and carbon trading that don't guarantee the emissions reductions of these local air pollutants in environmental justice communities, that's why when we talk about them from the EJ perspective, we have to reject them. Okay, so historically, communities of color have been left behind in our country. Let's not leave communities of color and low-income communities behind while we fight climate change. Because if we do, I have a question for you. If we're going to save the world by fighting climate change, who are we saving the world for?
That's right.
Go back to the founding of our country. The founders, I was going to say inexplicably, but it's not inexplicable. The founders left slavery intact. Sacrificed our communities, basically. Did you know that in the 1960s, John F. Kennedy, and I don't know if he did it through his brother Robert, actually contacted Martin Luther King and said, can you stop protesting for a while? Because we're fighting a Cold War with Russia. And you know what the Russians were saying? They were saying, hey, don't lecture us on being undemocratic. Look what you're doing to black folk in the United States. And let me say this. A lot of non-black people, I hate to put it that way, a lot of white people supported and joined the civil rights movement. And that's what we need now. Right? We need that type of support for the environmental justice movement, for the climate justice movement, for the movement to fight climate change. But we need to make sure that while we're doing that, we're also fighting for communities of color and low-income communities. So here's the challenge. Here's the challenge that we issue all the time to institutions and people who say, well, we support environmental justice. That's important to us. So if that's the case, then the challenge is, if you think EJ, if you say EJ and equity are important to you, and universities like the one I work at say that, right? Governmental policymakers say that, environmental groups say that. So the challenge is, if you say that, and if you mean that, then put your policy where your mouth is. Make achieving reductions of greenhouse gas co-pollutants, of fine particulate matter and sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, make achieving reductions of these air pollutants in environmental justice communities as important as achieving reductions of carbon dioxide. Make saving these communities as you're saving the world. Right? Make saving these communities as important as saving the world. So I'm going to stop there. We do have more details about our vision of how do you, I'm talking a lot, but how do you achieve this without using CCS and hydrogen co-firing and carbon dioxide. Through the day, and Cynthia and Brooke will talk a little bit about that, but through the day we'll talk about that. But I just wanted to start off the morning and leave you with this message. Don't leave communities of color. Don't leave communities with low income. Don't leave them behind. Don't make them sacrifice zones as we fight climate change.
Let's give another round of applause for Dr. Sheets. I'm going to take 30 seconds of facilitator's privilege to add a point as someone who aspires and practices allyship, to be an ally in right relationship with environmental justice communities. And that's, Dr. Sheets just outlined the moral case for why we need to practice and get in right relationship and be active allies in solidarity with environmental justice communities. But there's also a pragmatic case, and that is we will never build the political power needed and build a movement in which everyone sees their future being addressed and the issues that they're facing being addressed by the movement if we don't practice this same thing. So it is not only the morally correct thing to do, but politically we will never take on the fossil fuel industry, we will never take on organized capital and win unless everyone sees that their issues are centered in the climate justice movement. So, with that said, I want to introduce our next panelist. We are thrilled to have Brooke Helmick, who is the Law and Policy Program Manager for the New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance, which is an organization with deep roots and leadership in the local and national EJ movements. In her role, Brooke works to further education, advocacy, and policies that prioritize justice and equity for New Jersey's low-income communities and communities of color. Prior to joining the Alliance, Brooke worked as a research assistant for Princeton University Bridging Divides Initiative, as a community engagement graduate intern for All In Together, and as a policy fellow and disability rights advocate for the Los Angeles City Civil, Human Rights, and Equity Department. Let's give it up for Brooke Helmick.
Okay, hi y'all. It's good to be here. Good morning. So as Matt said, my name is Brooke Helmick, and I am the Law and Policy Manager for the New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance. So the way I describe what I do is essentially being a walking wiki page for the team, the communities we serve, and the organizations that we collaborate. And furthermore, really trying to find a way to make policy accessible to people. So highlighting the ways that decisions at the local, the regional, the state, and the federal level have direct impacts on people's health and their safety, as well as the health and safety of their family and loved ones and communities. So with that, I think part of what I really appreciate about working with NJEJA is that every bit of policy work that has come out of this organization for the last 22 years has been grounded in the needs of the local community. So with my background in gender theory and democratic stabilization, I think about the ways that we can include all voices, people, and community in building up structures that will benefit future generations and long outlive us. So when we think about a just transition, I was really excited for Matt to bring this up because I think there are a few key elements that need to be highlighted, which is one, as he mentioned, shifting from an extractive economy to a regenerative one. So for each thing that we take, we need to be giving back. The second key element is justice and equity, so including communities and ensuring that communities have the right to refuse projects, even projects that have been greenwashed. And third is building new relationships and forming alliances. Because I think there's a myth that's often fed to those that are fighting this highly exploitative, highly consumeristic system, which is that there is a limited amount of resources, or that this is how it's always been. But I think that we need to employ a lot of imagination and reject this idea that in order for our causes to win, somebody else has to lose. That's not true. We can build alliance, we can build solidarity as a coalition. So when I think about how to best frame a just transition, I approach this in terms of building out policy that has beneficial longevity and is equitable, it is well thought out, and as Dr. Sheets has said, it doesn't sacrifice frontline communities and EJ communities in the process. So as Dr. Sheets said, I'm going to get into a little bit of the specifics here. You'll have to forgive me. I love detail. Both my parents were teachers, so I'm going to give you all that hyper-specific info. So an interesting case study we're tackling right now is the real issue of carbon capture and the use of hydrogen. So as I'm sure y'all know, there is a ridiculous amount of greenwashing that's happening right now when it comes to the promotion of hydrogen and CCS, in part because of the sheer amount of money that's being poured into these projects. Hydrogen hubs alone are slated to receive $7 billion in federal funding from the Biden administration, administered through the DOE and OSED, the Department of Energy, and the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations. And these projects are flawed for a multitude of reasons, but the few I'll name here are one, they haven't been proven to be safe, and in many instances have actually failed. So CCS and blue hydrogen have underperformed when it comes to capture rates that are higher in theory than they are in practice, as well as examining CO2 storage, deployment, and storage performance. They pose an extremely high risk to host communities. So as Dr. Sheets has said, we cannot sacrifice EJ communities when we're talking about building out this infrastructure. And it's incredibly important to note that no matter what color hydrogen is produced, whether it's gray, blue, red, green, whatever, whenever it's combusted, it still emits co-pollutants. So, and then when we talk about the pipelines of these projects, there's only two ways to move hydrogen, which is pipelines and supercooled trucks. Those who want to facilitate Mach 2 are doing so under the guise of greenwashing and using existing pipelines, which is incredibly dangerous as hydrogen is incredibly small, it vibrates at a very high frequency, and when it's transported through pipes, particularly metal pipes, which are prone to hydrogen embrittlement, these molecules can cause fissures and they can cause leaks. And so the communities that surround these pipelines and the workers who operate this infrastructure face risks of leaks, explosions, and fires at all stages of the infrastructure: production, pipeline, storage, and end use. I'll also say that these projects aren't economically viable or financially feasible. So between 2010 and 2017, the DOE spent $1.1 billion on 9 demonstration projects. They require an immense amount of capital with their, at best, limited success rate. And they don't have sufficient community input, nor have they honored a community's right of refusal. So we have a better alternative. These technologies lock us into fossil fuels. They delay the transition to affordable and proven renewable alternatives in the power sector. And these renewables can reduce both greenhouse gas emissions and co-pollutants. So to tie this back to the just transition, I believe that no one group or movement can do this on their own. Each and every single one of us has a place in this transition, and so as we're fighting different issues, such as the development of Hydrogen Hub project, we do so from a multitude of perspectives, where we can flag the need for direct community engagement and honoring the right of refusal, the dangers associated from pollution and negative local air impacts, the public health risks, and the dangers to workers operating these facilities, and so on. There is no one issue related to the just transition that doesn't need all of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brooke. So we're going to change gears a little bit, and I think it's important to acknowledge right up front that this is really, at least for Food and Water Watch, our first attempt, and there are many co-sponsor organizations. So this is a broad coalition event. This is really our first attempt to try and formally bring people together around this just transition framework and talk about the intersections between labor and worker issues with climate and environmental justice issues. And I have long been inspired by the work of our next speaker, who is deeply rooted here in the city of New Brunswick with an organization, New Labor. And Ronalda Cruz is an organizer with New Labor. She is originally from Mexico and came to the United States in 1991. She's a mother of 3 children and has worked in several different industries, including warehouses, through temporary agencies, and in restaurants and hotels. She has been a member of New Labor since 2007, having first got involved in the campaign for comprehensive immigration reform for everyone. She was also a part of the important winning campaign to pass a bill in the New Jersey legislature for driver's license for all New Jersey residents. Ronalda has worked on campaigns to pass a bill for paid sick leave, a bill against the epidemic of wage theft, and a $15 minimum wage. She's been on staff as an organizer with New Labor since 2014, where she continues to fight to improve the conditions of workers and to ensure that workers' voices are heard. I'm going to pause there. There's a number of current campaigns that Ronalda is working on. I hope that she will mention them. But I'm particularly inspired by the work that New Labor has also done to build coalition here in the city of New Brunswick and across New Jersey, even when it is technically not even their issue. New Labor was one of the largest contingents, the single largest contingent of New Jerseyans who showed up at the historic March to End Fossil Fuels in New York City this past summer. And their organizer, Raphael, was quoted in the New York Times feature piece. So it shows you how workers' voices are central to this movement. So let's give a warm round of applause to Ronalda Cruz.
Thank you, Matt. Gracias a todos por estar aquí hoy. Realmente es muy importante porque, como Matt dijo, mi nombre es Reinalda Cruz, soy organizadora de la organización New Labor aquí en New Brunswick, y realmente la justicia climática también es justicia para el trabajador. El problema del cambio climático realmente nos está afectando a todos, no nada más en este país, sino también en todos los otros países. Yo principalmente, como Matt dijo, soy mexicana y realmente una parte de la migración de los trabajadores inmigrantes que vienen a este país, que son mexicanos, se han venido realmente porque el cambio climático nos ha afectado tanto que hemos tenido que emigrar aquí a los Estados Unidos. Realmente México está en una posición de contaminación muy alta y no sé si alguno de ustedes ha viajado a México y se ha dado cuenta de estas circunstancias. Cuando llegamos aquí, también vemos que realmente el cambio climático también nos afecta aquí como trabajadores, porque empezamos a trabajar no nada más dentro de un lugar, en una oficina, sino que los trabajadores inmigrantes estamos trabajando en todas las industrias, donde el cambio climático nos está afectando con demasiado calor en los warehouses, demasiado frío, la gente que trabaja en landscaping y cuando la temperatura llega muy alta y hay veces que los empleadores no les otorgan ni agua. ¿Ustedes creen que eso es justo? No es justo. No es justo porque nosotros como trabajadores merecemos respeto, merecemos descanso, merecemos agua. ¿Por qué? Porque el calor es demasiado extremo. Me tocó ver trabajadores aquí en New Brunswick, en un warehouse donde printean las playeras. ¿Y qué pasa ahí? No tienen aire acondicionado. Y los trabajadores en tiempo de calor se están desmayando de calor. Y en tiempo de frío, es demasiado frío que hay que trabajar con nuestras chamarras puestas. ¿Por qué? Porque tampoco tienen, estos empleadores tampoco ponen heat caliente para que estos trabajadores se mantengan calientitos. Y en tiempo de calor tampoco tienen aire acondicionado. A pesar de que se hacen quejas a OSHA, hemos hecho una queja a OSHA donde se les pudo lograr que les pusieran unos abanicos grandes. Pero ¿qué hacen? Los empleadores no los prenden. Solamente si saben que OSHA va a llegar los prenden, pero mientras no, están afectando la vida del trabajador. Nosotros como New Labor vemos que realmente los trabajadores inmigrantes somos los más afectados con el cambio climático. ¿Qué ha pasado con los huracanes que han pasado en New Jersey? La mayoría de los trabajadores viven en los basements, se les han inundado los basements. Ahorita recién acaba de pasar un temblor que por años, yo tengo aquí más de 32 años y no había pasado eso. En México tiembla a cada rato, nosotros ya no es sorpresa para nosotros, pero aquí es diferente. ¿Y qué pasa? Estamos viendo que este cambio realmente, desde cuando yo vine ya se hablaba del cambio climático, pero estoy viendo que cada día es más y más. Y nuestros gobernadores y nuestro presidente realmente debe de tomar prioridad. En lugar de dar dinero a la guerra, debería dar fondos para que esta parte empezara a solucionarse. Nuestro gobernador Murphy debería de dar fondos también para que sigamos educando a nuestra comunidad, porque algo muy importante que nosotros las organizaciones hacemos es educar a la comunidad y a los trabajadores que el cambio climático existe y que está aquí con nosotros y que debemos cambiar nuestras mentes. Educarnos para que podamos solucionar esto y que nuestras familias en el futuro no estén padeciendo, no estén con asma, no estén sufriendo todo este cambio. Pero debemos realmente trabajar juntos. Las organizaciones, los grupos, el mismo gobierno debe de trabajar junto con nosotros para que podamos lograr un cambio duradero. Porque lo que necesitamos es un cambio duradero. Y realmente yo me siento orgullosa de ser mexicana y de representar a los trabajadores inmigrantes en este país. ¿Por qué? Porque los trabajadores inmigrantes dejamos nuestras vidas aquí. Así que Mi invitación es esa, que sigamos trabajando juntos más que nada y que podamos trabajar con la comunidad y que esta energía limpia que el gobernador Murphy ha hablado tanto, no solamente sea para las grandes corporaciones, para los millonarios, sino que también la comunidad inmigrante pobre tenga acceso y pueda tener el día de mañana este acceso a esta energía limpia. Y queremos también otra parte muy importante que los quiero invitar a todos, es que cada año New Labor por muchos años viene haciendo una marcha el día 28 de abril conmemorando a todos los trabajadores que han muerto o han tenido un accidente en su lugar de trabajo, y en el cual también marchamos por la justicia climática, que es justicia del trabajador. Entonces están todos invitados. Es marzo 28 a la 1 en la 55 de la Patterson Street, aquí en New Brunswick. Gracias.
Let's give Ronaldo another warm round of applause. See a lot of beautiful orange in the crowd today. And yeah, I just want to also amplify that Workers' Memorial Day March is happening on Sunday, April 28th, here in New Brunswick at 1 p.m. 55 Patterson Street in New Brunswick, New Jersey, Sunday, April 28th, 1 p.m. And there's a sign-in sheet on a clipboard that's being passed around if you're interested in getting more information about that. But let's show up for Workers' Memorial Day the same way that New Labor showed up for the March to End Fossil Fuels. So our next panelist is a dear friend and comrade, and I am stalling to get her bio up. Cynthia Mayone coordinates the work on the false solution of geoengineering for the Climate Justice Alliance, which is a national coalition linking over 90 frontline communities across the United States, Puerto Rico, and Guam. Cynthia was formerly the EJ organizer for the Ironbound Community Corporation in Newark, where she initiated programs that are still unfolding, including the organization's work on urban agriculture. Cynthia has served as co-chair of the Newark Environmental Commission, where she played a leading role in getting Newark's Environmental Justice Cumulative Impacts Ordinance passed. Cynthia currently serves on the steering committee of the New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance. Increasingly, Cynthia is engaged in music and art as political practice. Cynthia is a member of the Jersey City-based group Segunda Quimbamba, which performs and teaches traditional Puerto Rican music and dance. Let's give it up for Cynthia.
Good afternoon, muy buenas tardes. Es un honor estar aquí con todos ustedes. It's an honor to be here with all of you today and with such wonderful panelists. Oh, it's not working so good. Real environmental justice leaders and pioneers and innovators in New Jersey. I kind of want to talk about this term false solutions, that we consider a lot of the things that are being promoted, and definitely the whole notion that we can scoop CO2 out of the air and scrape it out of factories and bury it underground and carry it across the land, and now they're talking about carrying it overseas and shipping it to Mexico, and a number of really scary plans. Those are false solutions. At no time when we hear people talking about these plans do we ever hear them talk about cutting back on fossil fuel use. And there's a number of discrepancies and competitions in this country. I recognize I'm paying a lot of attention to state constitutions, state Supreme Courts. Some places like Montana have made it illegal to speak against coal. it's very, very odd. I mean, if you like weird stuff and weird, it's like, you know, I pay attention to that. It's more interesting than science fiction movies, the stuff that is going on. But we need to pay close attention to it because it's going to be playing out in the next election. And I don't want to ramble too much, but I want to point out this whole concept of false solutions as applied to what we call CCS, climate capture and storage. The dangers, as I said, of the pipelines. A pipeline exploded in Louisiana last week, I think it was. There's been very little information about that. We do know people in Louisiana that we're hoping are following up and are going to inform us. It's distressing to me that this, what we call Inflation Reduction Act, which is often being touted as just a very, very major green piece of legislation, has so much money in it for false solutions. And that's awkward and difficult for people who are concerned at this election climate about what that means. But to be funding and giving tax breaks for CCS, for carbon capture, and for hydrogen is what we're seeing played out. And as we're talking about these big projects, the hydrogen hub that we're all very concerned about, and the way they're mishandling that, I would say, the Mach 2 is the one that's for our region. I like to spell it M-O-C-K. I don't know what the M-A-C-H spelling is supposed to stand for. But as we speak, there are private actors imposing hydrogen hubs on indigenous tribal communities, on smaller towns. Some of the more isolated groups that don't have as much access to urban centers where a lot of information or more information is flowing are being approached. And you can be sure that those actors are looking to get that tax break, and they're approaching communities where they have not had the political information or been armed with some of the info that a lot of us spend time trying to get. And people contact me about that stuff because I'm kind of on this weird circuit of people who've been, on the weird edge of this. So that's how I'm learning about it. And we're trying to figure out how to support those communities. But I also think there's going to be a lot of, I don't know what you call them, fake, people, business people approaching groups, because everybody wants to be on the winning side of the opportunities. And communities also really need money, and farmers need ways to make money on their land. That's what farmers are about. So I'm just I'm throwing out a note of caution as we come into this accelerating. The other thing I really wanted to share with you is I work with the Climate Justice Alliance, which lots of organizations around the country belong to. It's an umbrella group. And I was given the mandate some years ago to study and start to develop policy around geoengineering false solutions. And when I talk about that, carbon capture and storage are part of that. Maybe you have heard of some of these plans to shoot, how would you say, like inject into the atmosphere substances to dim the sun's rays. That's called, the source of all life. The sun is being demonized these days in some of these circles, and it's not a small thing. It's called solar geoengineering or solar radiation management. There's a whole school of thought based in Harvard, based at the University of Chicago, that wants to do these types of experiments. They are so dangerous that to do them as an experiment is actually deploying it. And it runs the danger of destabilizing Earth's systems, which we all rely on. The Harvard, I should also say that every place they've wanted to try that experiment has been on indigenous territory or in very close to or on indigenous lands. We have in our little cohort of activists that includes the Indigenous Environmental Network and some groups that are based not in the US but have kind of offices around the world. Very small, but because of our contacts, we've managed to block those experiments twice. They wanted to do one near Tucson, Arizona, and their indigenous people organized in a way that put that Harvard research group on the hot seat so bad. They didn't want to come up against that, so they closed down the experiment. They just closed down the whole department at Harvard, their geoengineering shop. However, I looked at their propaganda piece and it said that they didn't do that experiment because they couldn't, there was a shortage of the type of balloon they needed to do it. We know who really stopped that. It was those prayer circles. We also worked with the Sami people to block a similar experiment in Sweden. So they do this where they think they can get away with it, but they haven't so far. They're getting madder and madder, and you're going to see, I think, more of this. Right now they're trying to do an experiment with cloud brightening in California. I think that's going on, and I actually don't like spending my time on that, but I do obsessively and try to link our groups so that we can be ready for it and also figure out how we can support each other. There is an online bulletin called Geoengineering Monitor, GeoMon, that tracks these, and they also have an interactive map that you can go to and you can see where these things are planned or taking place all over the world, including the CCS experiments, the carbon capture experiments, or the carbon capture efforts, none of which are really proven to be successful at this point. I should point out that most of the carbon that is captured in those systems is used for enhanced oil extraction. Most of it gets pumped down oil wells that are kind of not very productive anymore. That is where the vast majority of that captured carbon is used. So it's a cyclical activity that actually is continuing carbon storage. So the levels of hypocrisy are really high. And the other thing I wanted to mention, because some of us are talking about this, as we move through efforts at a just transition of fossil fuels, and I wish I was more hopeful about that and the speed at which is going or not going. How do we talk about community benefits agreements, which we like to see, for a project that's essentially wrong and harmful? And there's some people that are really trying to be very thoughtful about talking about that, but that's something I just wanted to put out there as we try to look for ways of achieving a just transition that are inclusive and that are sustainable, right? So I'm going to stop there. I hope we can do questions so we can talk to each other more. I'm going to be here all day. I'd love to put people in touch with these networks so that you can be checking out those bulletins and keeping track. And we'd love to find people who want to work more on this. So I hope I haven't forgotten anything, but I'm sure my fellow panelists will let me know. Thank you.
Let's give it up for Cynthia again. I just want to make a quick announcement, which is we have one more panelist, and then we're going to go to our question and answer, and then we're going to take a quick photo and then lunch. But for the question and answer, our wonderful organizer who's based out of South Jersey, New Jersey, Kate Delaney, over here, is going to help facilitate the question and answer. If you have a question that you know you want to ask one or multiple of the panelists, and you know it now, raise your hand, and Kate will come and get you an index card and a pen so you can submit your question. Or if at any point during the final panel speaker or during the Q&A you have a question, raise your hand, and Kate will come over with an index card and pen. And thank you so much, Kate, for facilitating. Our final panelist, last and certainly not least, is also our host for today. Todd Bacone, PhD, is an assistant professor in the Department of Labor Studies and Employment Relations, and the director of the Labor Education Action Research Network, or LEARN, at Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey. Todd's latest book, Clean Air and Good Jobs, U.S. Labor and the Struggle for Climate Justice, is about the emerging labor climate movement within the U.S. labor movement. This was released in early 2023. And Todd also is the chair of the Rutgers Faculty Union Climate Justice Committee. He also serves on the board of the National AAUP Climate Justice Committee, which was the first national labor union in the country to pass a resolution in support of a Green New Deal for our country. Todd will discuss the contours of the emerging labor climate movement and demonstrate what can be envisioned and accomplished when climate justice is on labor's agenda and when unions work together with other movements to formulate solutions to the climate crisis. Let's give it up for Todd Bacone.
Thanks, Matt. Good afternoon, everyone. How are we feeling? Good. Get the wiggles, shake it up a little bit. So I'm Todd Vachon, and I did want to thank you again for coming to our beautiful Labor Education Center. This room is filled with a lot of history, and I'm hoping that everybody here is going to make the future history that we can talk about this moment today when we came together in this room, what we all did together coming out of this gathering today. So thank you for coming together here and joining us in the Labor Education Center. So I'm actually going to save some of my more technical remarks for the question and answer portion. But I did just kind of want to start with, we have this phrase, just transition. Does anybody actually know where that originates from?
Labor movement.
David Hughes, the labor movement. Yes, were you going to say something?
Wasn't it coal at the coal union? Right?
Close. I'm going to direct everybody's attention to the light blue banner right there. In the top left back there, it says Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union, the OCAW. There was a very important leader in that union by the name of Tony Mazzocchi, and he was an advocate for workplace health and safety, but he was also an ardent progressive activist and an anti-war activist. His members were responsible for building ICBM missiles and nuclear warheads. So he had this conundrum. We need to eliminate my members' jobs to save the planet, to save humanity. However, my members graduated high school, went to work at a factory, now they have a mortgage, they have debt on a car, they're raising children, trying to send them to college. We can't just throw them under the bus, right? Because they're doing the work that they've been hired to do, right? And he said at that time, we have a super fund for dirt. We need to have a super fund for workers. And that is the origin of the term just transition, right? So there's two parts to it. Just, meaning the origin word of justice, like to be done in a fair and righteous way, and transition, shifting from one way of doing things to another way of doing things. So that's the simplest definition of just transition. Now, if you ask any of us here or anybody in the room, you're going to find about as many different understandings of that as there are people who use the phrase. But I wanted to use my brief remarks here in the opening to actually tell you why I came to study labor and climate issues, and I think why Matt asked me to be here is largely because I absolutely agree with everything that the previous speaker said, and I consider myself a climate justice and an environmental justice advocate, but I come with a lifetime of experience in the labor movement as a union member, as a worker, as an organizer, and as a leader in the labor movement. So that's the perspective I'm hoping to bring here today, and I'm going to tell you how I came to be an advocate for labor and climate. And it's a little bit of a personal narrative, so bear with me. I trace it back to 1989. All right, how many people here were not yet born in 1989? All right, young people in the house, woo! So, aging myself here a little bit, I was 13 years old, I was in middle school in 1989, and I learned two very, very important lessons that year, right? The first one I learned in the classroom, and the second one I learned through my own life experiences in my family. So at the time, my family owned a very small gas station and general store in eastern Connecticut. And this town was about 1,400 population, very rural, white, working class, poor, agricultural type of town, right? It was the one store in town. We were facing bankruptcy. It was really difficult economic times. We were a very working, poor family. My father was really concerned with how we were going to pay the bills. He actually had a gambling problem for a while because of this, right? There was a lot of alcoholism in the family. Thankfully, my father was a member of the volunteer fire department, and one of his friends in the fire department said, hey, the Carpenters Union needs a whole lot of new people to get involved because they're building, guess what? A natural gas power plant up the road. So my father went down and he became a member of the Carpenters Union in 1989. And I can tell you that within a year, we went from being a very poor family to being an absolutely middle-class family. I got Nikes, I got glasses, I got braces, right? This was a transformative experience for me economically, right? However, one other thing happened in 1989. Anybody know what else happened in 1989 on the climate side of it? Hint, hint, hint.
Oh, Exxon. Yeah. In Alaska.
That did happen, but that's not the one I'm thinking of. James Hansen, Dr. James Hansen went and testified before Congress about the effects of burning fossil fuel causing global warming. And it was at the time called the greenhouse effect. It still is the greenhouse effect. But we learned about it then, and my sciences teacher in 8th grade came in and taught us all about the greenhouse effect. So here's a conundrum for a 13-year-old of, wow, the union job is really good for our family, but building power plants like this is really bad for the planet. What are we going to do about this? So we fast forward. From that experience, I went on and I only ever took union jobs on principle. When I was a teenager, I washed dishes at a nursing home that was unionized, so I was a member of the SEIU. As a summer job, I worked at the paper plant, so I was a member of the steel workers. I then actually worked at the nuclear power plant for a while as a laborer, as a fire watch, which is the guy that sits on the milk crate with a fire extinguisher and watches the people do the real work, but if something starts on fire, I put it out. 1992, 16 years old. $15 an hour, sitting on a milk crate, holding a fire extinguisher. Here we are in 2024, fighting for young people working full-time to make $15 an hour after 30 plus years of inflation. They should be fighting for $30 an hour. So I eventually ended up going through the carpenter's apprenticeship program and following in my father's footsteps, and I worked as a union carpenter for about a decade until something else happened historically around 2008, 2009. We all remember that. Well, maybe not all of us. Anybody born after 2008? All right, we don't have, yes. Woo! So the financial crisis and the Great Recession. So like all of my other union sisters and brothers, we were unemployed. Well past unemployment benefits ended. It was 2 years. There was no construction. Nothing was being built, right? The way that the construction industry works is when something gets built, the hall, the union hall, brings all the workers in. They all go work, build the thing, then you all get laid off. And you're unemployed until something new is getting built. So that's why you see so often the construction unions supporting every project, right? They're going to support offshore wind, and they're going to support the natural gas power plant at the same time without passing any moral judgment. It's because otherwise their members are unemployed, right? So this is their access to employment. So I ended up going back to college, and here I am now. I got a PhD. Did not ever intend to get a PhD. First in the family to go to college, and when I got to the university, guess what? I was a graduate assistant, and we didn't have a union. This is my first non-union job, and it was kind of shitty, right? They were taking our health insurance away in an email. So a bunch of us got together and we organized a local of the United Auto Workers at the University of Connecticut. And so 2,100 teaching and research assistants. We bargained our first contract. I had the honor and privilege of serving as the first union president. And the first thing that I did after we won our contract is said to the rest of the executive board, we should poll the members on what the issues are that they care about. Because we now have a voice. We now have power, right? We're part of the United Auto Workers. We can go lobby Congress. We can go use our voices in a collective way to affect change. And guess what one of the #1 issues was? Climate change. So think of the demographics of my union. It's people that are 24 to 34 years old, college educated. A lot of them actually climate scientists studying climate science, right? So this is our bargaining unit. This is our union. So we reached out to this group that was just forming called the Connecticut Roundtable on Climate and Jobs, which I wish we had an equivalent of in New Jersey, because it's a fabulous formation of faith-based groups, environmental justice groups, big green organizations, and labor. And what they do is they get together quarterly and they talk about the tough issues and they find out the common ground and they work together on the things that they can agree on, right? And they've accomplished quite a bit in Connecticut around that model of building that trust and relationship. So that fast forward, that brings me on to where I am here. I did my dissertation on exactly that because I was involved in this group in Connecticut and I needed to write a dissertation about something. So I said, well, I might as well feed two birds with one hand and make my activism also be my job. So that worked out well. And I'm really happy to be here with you all today, and I hope through the questions I could talk a little bit more about what I found in my research for the book about what labor's demands are for a just transition, and why it's so important that we bring all of our interests together, as Matt said, the real pragmatic argument, because if we're just trying to address climate and it's not addressing environmental justice, then Nikki's not down with it. If it's down to address climate change but not address jobs, the AFL-CIO is not down with it, right? So if we don't have something in there for all of the vital stakeholders and come together with a broad base of support, there's always going to be an organized force of opposition against addressing the climate crisis. And that's really, that's our obstacle and that's our challenge that I hope we can kind of brainstorm throughout the rest of the day today. So thank you. Matt.
Let's give Todd one more round of applause. As an excellent speaker and an excellent host for us today, we're so grateful to have the support of the Learn Center. To be able to do events like this is just critical. So again, just as a reminder, if you have a question, raise your hand. Kate Delaney will try to find you with a card and a pen to submit your question. But we're going to start off with a couple pre-drafted questions, and the first is, and this is open to any panelists who want to weigh in. What do the environmental justice and labor movements consider to be essential elements of a just transition off of fossil fuels? We do have another, I think we have another mic that we'll try.
I just spoke, so I'm going to give it to somebody else.
Well, yeah, I don't want to beat a dead horse, but but as you transition off of fossil fuels, just make sure that you don't have an unintended consequence of harming EJ communities. Let me give you an example. There has been, which we support, there has been a movement, well, now it's just, do away with fossil fuels, right? For a while it was, don't build any more new fossil fuel power plants. And that sounds good, right? And we thought it was good too from the EJ perspective, but, did you see the but coming? But think about this. Most fossil fuel plants, or disproportionate number of fossil fuel plants, are located in environmental justice communities. And that's one reason why we want them to reduce emissions of the coal pollutants. So if you don't build any new ones and demand for electricity goes up, then those existing power plants will run more. They'll put out more pollution. Where are they located? So you're going to harm EJ communities, or a very good possibility of harming EJ communities. And so for us, it wasn't that we didn't want that, but we said, well, you got to couple that with a policy that's going to protect these communities somehow. Well, you can't just say no more fossil fuel plants, no new fossil fuel plants. Well, then you have to do something else. And we're going to do this to protect EJ communities. And I'm looking at Todd, and we're going to do this to help the workers, right? That need to work. So you really have to, and that's why for both these issues, I guess, when I said integrate EJ and justice up front, right? So that means that you will think about those type of policies. And what Todd can talk about, and integrate, and Ramona can talk about, and integrate the labor issues up front too, right? So that you're not doing the climate change mitigation policy and forgetting all these other policies along with. And by the way, we call that carbon centrism, right? In the EJ movement, the just focus on carbon so much that you're not focusing on these other issues that you need to have a just transition.
Thank you. So I guess an important thing to think of from the labor perspective is that labor is not a monolith, right? What I spoke about was my experience in the building trades as a carpenter. I'm now involved with the faculty union, the American Federation of Teachers, right? And it's a wildly different beast, right? Because you have to think the way climate change itself is going to impact workers, and you have to think about the way that climate mitigation is going to impact workers, right? So for teachers and for nurses and for service sector workers, the concern is really around addressing climate change because the impacts of it right now are killing our members, right? Educators are teaching the next generation of youth who are going to have to grow up in a world that's not livable, right? So you see the teachers' unions and the nurses' unions at the forefront standing in solidarity around climate issues. And you're more likely to see the construction unions saying, well, where are the jobs, right? And the main reason for that is, as we all know at this point, we have insane income inequality in the United States. It's been skyrocketing for 50 years. The average income of production workers is the same today as it was in 1978. There's been no increase. Meanwhile, CEO pay has gone up like 1 million-fold. So all the money is going to the top. Unionization is down, not because people have given up unions, but because companies have moved all of the manufacturing overseas, and then all of the new industry that's arisen, like the Starbucksification of our economy and Walmartification of our economy, are actively anti-union, and our labor law allows them to be so because there's no penalty for them to bust union organizers. So what we have seen is the inability to organize and win wage gains for all of the new jobs that have been created over the past 40 years. So the alternative when you lose your good union job is a bad non-union job. So I think a key piece of a just transition is making all jobs good jobs. So that requires changes to labor law to make it easier for workers to organize a union in their workplace. It requires increases to the minimum wage, and it requires a stronger social safety net, because another part of the fear when union workers lose their job, they lose their health insurance, and not just for themselves, but for their children and their families, right? They also they've been contributing to a pension or a retirement plan. No longer gonna have that, right? So the more we can create a strong social wage where we have universal health care for everyone, where wages are high enough for everybody to live off of, where everybody who wants a union can have a union, then the transition becomes very uncontested. In fact, if you look in most of European countries, you don't find unions being opposed to climate issues. In fact, they're in the lead on it because they already have health insurance and free college tuition and pensions no matter what job they take, right? In the US, we don't have that. We're stuck like lobsters in a pot trying to get out, stepping on each other's head trying to get out of the pot. And that's the mentality we need to get over, right? We need to think more universal in our social programming for everybody.
Bueno, a mí solo me gustaría decir algo que realmente, en verdad, es verdad, sería todo perfecto si todos los trabajadores pudieran tener sindicatos, pero lamentablemente en la comunidad inmigrante, para los trabajadores inmigrantes, la mayoría estamos trabajando sin sindicatos, en la cual nosotros no tenemos igualdad de pago siquiera, a pesar de que hay leyes que nos protegen, pero realmente es seguir trabajando juntos para que nosotros los trabajadores inmigrantes, los miembros de nuestra organización New Labor, tengan sindicatos y tengan beneficios, y el día que no tengan un trabajo puedan ir a colectar también, porque realmente durante la pandemia todos estos trabajadores no pudieron llevar la comida a su casa porque no pudieron tomar una colecta, no, el gobierno no les dio dinero. Entonces para nosotros es bien difícil, pero nada es imposible y vamos a seguir luchando para mejorar nuestras condiciones laborales.
Thank you so much. I wanted to direct one other question to Reynalda, but of course others can jump in. But Reynalda, I'm curious, do you, how do you talk to members of the community here in New Brunswick or New Labour members about climate change? Or how do they talk about it? Like, what are they concerned about? And maybe like either in addition or alternatively, how do you see the people in this room being able to build relationships and organize in solidarity with frontline workers?
Bueno, realmente entre nosotros, entre los miembros de nuestra organización, cuando nos juntamos en nuestras reuniones, hablamos mucho sobre el cambio climático. Cómo es que realmente venimos a este país es porque realmente nos afecta el cambio climático en nuestros países y todas las circunstancias que enfrentamos al llegar aquí. Y pues realmente llegamos aquí y seguimos enfrentando las circunstancias porque realmente uno de los problemas más grandes es que, por ejemplo, en México nuestros ríos se están secando, no tenemos suficiente agua. Y cuando venimos aquí, como estas grandes corporaciones nos hacen trabajar para ellos, exigiéndonos una producción tan fuerte, porque realmente, por ejemplo, las fábricas de plástico, las personas que trabajan ahí haciendo los botes para el agua, las tapas para los botes para el agua, son lugares muy calientes y cómo les exigen esa producción que tiene que ser por producción y el que no haga la producción va para afuera. Entonces, realmente nuestras conversaciones son esas que nos están afectando. El cambio climático nos está afectando nuestros bolsillos, nos está afectando psicológicamente porque tenemos miedo a que vengan esos grandes huracanes, a que qué vamos a hacer, quién nos va a apoyar cuando realmente no podamos tener una vivienda digna, cuando no tengamos dinero para agua purificada. Entonces, todo eso nos está afectando no nada más a los miembros, sino también a nuestra comunidad. ¿Qué hacer cuando un huracán? Es más que nada, nosotros estamos apoyando con educación, pero sí nos gustaría que todos los que están aquí apoyaran nuestras organizaciones, no nada más New Labour, sino yo sé que hay muchas otras organizaciones que apoyan a la comunidad, también a los científicos que hacen tanta investigación, que esa investigación no solamente sea para el gobierno, sino que sea pública, que la comunidad la oiga, la escuche, para que la comunidad tome acción, porque sí lo que queremos es que nuestra comunidad tome acción, porque hay veces que no sabemos lo que pasa, no sabemos que las investigaciones solamente a veces no son públicas, sino que solamente el gobierno las tiene y el gobierno dice lo bueno, no dice lo malo, no dice qué es lo que estamos pasando, ni lo que nos va a pasar en el futuro.
Okay, I think I want to transition to questions from the audience. So thank you everyone who submitted a question. We probably will not get to answer all of them today, otherwise we'd have to skip lunch. But I will see if we can facilitate these questions getting to panelists and perhaps publishing them on the website for this summit. And we have all your emails now because you've all signed up with us, so we can share that information. But I feel like I'm curious to hear from Brooke, but of course any panelist can answer this question. This was submitted by a student organizer at Princeton, Kristen, who asks, can you speak about your experience or tips for new organizers on how to balance joy and community/capacity building with tangible structural action? So I think it's somewhat a work-life balance, but also how are we building these movements that hold all of the things that need to be prioritized?
That's a great question, and I wish I had an intelligent response to it, because I'm still figuring it out. I think a lot of it is sitting with the both good and bad. I remember my sophomore year of college, so my first year of college, I had done, they called it like Team Green, and you did recycling, and you did, all the good, happy things that you think about when you talk about the planet. And then the second year I did it, I took some environmental science classes, and then they told me all the terrible things. And the class was like, hey, recycling is great, but do you know how much plastic doesn't get recycled? Or, hey, we're doing all these awesome things, and I'm drinking out of my straw and I'm trying to be good, and then, hey, do you know how much pollution is still happening while you're walking to class? We're all friends here, so I'll say it. I was in a very dark place because it was really hard to balance, and you were just one person in a huge planet with a lot of people who make money off of killing the planet. And it's really hard to hold. It's hard to hold that and also be like, I want to grow up and have a good job, and I want to travel, and I want to see all these places that are being destroyed by climate change. And I also want to go back to my hometown and breathe clean air. The neighborhood I'm from is so highly industrialized, filled with warehouses, right by an airport, centered between freeways. We're in a valley, so all of the pollution settles. And you don't think about that when you're a little kid on the playground. And then you grow up and you're like, oh my God, how many other little kids are breathing this just like I did? And now I have asthma and have to take a daily inhaler and carry my emergency inhaler everywhere. But at the same time, all of that darkness and that heaviness aside, there's also so much joy that can be had in knowing that you're doing something that's much, much bigger than you, that decades of people have done before me, and decades of people will do after me, and hopefully do it a lot better than I'm doing it. And that sort of joy can ground you, and I think you have to get very comfortable with holding both of those things at the same time, and then still purposing in your heart that you're gonna keep doing the work that needs to be doing, and you're gonna find a way to make a job out of it. I did not think I'd get paid for doing this kind of work, and then I found this organization, and I was so blown away by how happy I could be coming into an office every day. So I think you can do all of these things and feel like it's contradictory, and also have it not be contradictory at the same time.
Thank you so much, Brooke. And the next three questions are highly related, overlapping. Some of them are directed directly for Todd, but I think anyone can weigh in. And I'll just read them. At times it seems as though labor unions are at odds with environmental justice groups on policy, especially with framework on just transition. Some labor unions are apprehensive and discriminatory due to fear of change and loss of jobs. How do we come together towards progressive change? Labor unions have traditionally left people who look like people in environmental justice communities out of union jobs through gatekeeping. Please share how I can convince a skeptic to accept that labor unions are aligned with EJ communities. And lastly, how specifically can labor include Black and brown people, not exclude them in its climate change work? So anyone, but yeah, you're welcome to take first.
Yes, very good question, very important question. I do want to uplift again that labor is not a monolith, right? A lot of these critiques are absolutely correct, and I think a lot of it you have to look at the origins and the history of labor in the US, and there's really two models of unionism in the US. There's what's called craft unionism, and there's what's called industrial unionism. Craft unionism is a model of organizing and building power by exclusion. That's largely how the skilled trades, like the plumbers and pipe fitters, build their power, right? You have a skilled set of workers, you reduce the number of workers that do it, you require the use of union workers on jobs, it increases the wages of those workers. That's a model for building economic power, and that's a model that dates back to the days when slavery still existed in the United States. So that is a legacy of long-term structural racism. And there's a lot of reproduction in those unions familially, right? My father, my grandfather, my great-grandfather, right? Look at me, I'm the son of a union carpenter, I went into the carpenters union. So there's a lot of that for sure, right? So that's reproduction of racial exclusion by de facto. However, on the other side of the labor movement, manufacturing unions, service sector unions, very diverse. Public sector unions, incredibly diverse, right? Which is often why those unions are under the greatest attack from right-wing forces in this country, right? The postal workers are always under attack. State employees are always under attack. But these are the unions that uplift black and brown workers and women workers the most, right? Because they have the highest ratio of workers that are diversified. And those are the unions that are engaged more in climate justice now. So if you look at the SEIU, the Service Employees International Union, they've been very proactive on climate justice issues. 32BJ, which represents building service workers, and they're actually active right in Newark, but especially active in New York City, have been really on the front around climate justice issues. So it's important to, I guess, think about which unions, right? Now, in terms of getting construction unions on board, again, it always comes down to jobs. And construction unions have been trying, supposedly, to diversify their membership for a long time. But there's two sides to the diversity problem, right? One is there's always been exclusion. And two, because there's always been exclusion, if you come into an entirely white workforce and you're a non-white person, the culture and the relationships and the microaggressions on the job make you not want to stay there very long. It doesn't feel comfortable and welcoming. So despite even the efforts of well-intentioned labor leaders to try and reach out to communities of color and bring people into the union, it's a challenge, right? I don't have the answer to it. I wish that I did. My general answer is we need to make all jobs good union jobs, right? So you don't have to try and fight for those few limited positions, right? I take more of the industrial approach to unionizing. In fact, I think we should have one big union for the whole working class and have a general strike and shut this shit down to fix every problem. But that's gonna take a lot more work. I don't know if anybody else wants to add.
Great, I think this will be our last question, and again, we'll try and facilitate answers to the other ones because there have been an amazing amount of really thoughtful questions. But this is, for any of the panelists, with all that's going on in terms of environmental injustice, what work is being done that you're aware of to empower low-income neighborhoods and disenfranchised communities around climate education, as well as clean energy accessibility? And this was from Rashad, who's the vice president of the Piscataway Youth Progressives Organization. Anyone? Yes, so it's really a two-part question. It's what is being done to combat environmental injustice in the realms of education for young people and or making clean energy more accessible to environmental justice communities.
I can talk about the education. Hi. I want to talk a little bit about my experience in my own community where I live, the East Ward of Newark, often known as the Ironbound, which is about to experience scary gentrification, I think, by just people's sheer community living to make a good place to live in spite of it being one of the most polluted zip codes in the country. All you have to do is say 07105 and anybody engaged in environmental pollution knows where that is. Home to the biggest Superfund site in the country, which is the Passaic River, which was polluted with when they made Agent Orange in a factory on the banks of it during the Vietnam War. It's polluted with dioxin, one of the most carcinogenic substances known. Some of us sit on a community advisory group hoping for a cleanup, and that cleanup will come. It's Superfund, right? But people are lying and trying to minimize it and make it not happen. I want to say that our work at Ironbound Community Corporation, where I got my training in environmental justice, has been multi-generational. The community center, I never felt interested in it because it looked like it was just services. I was a neighbor, right? And then I got recruited to come to work there, literally. And I started, the first day they gave me these books about environmental justice and said to go read them. And the work that takes place, as I say, multi-generational, I feel proud of. Like, my predecessor used to just walk the Passaic and tell people not to fish. because people, it's an immigrant community, and people like to fish in the river, and if you eat that fish, you will die, right? But we were able to build out an environmental justice program over time, partly by doing things that attracted people, like, we started gardening and just got people into it. Now we have to use brought in soil. All of the land is contaminated there. We use raised beds. But I was just thinking about it the other day. People got so interested in that they wanted to stick around for something I created called the Clean Air Committee. So after we'd come and sit down and, have a drink of water or something, we'd start to talk about the different types of things that we need to do. And, I think the organizing there around clearly fighting the power plants, fighting the incinerator, all the multiple layering of environmental overburdenedness. And of course, I'm kind of singing our praises in our own community because it's really the only one I really know firsthand how that work is being done. However, most people get it and have continued to stay engaged there. In terms, there's a lot. There's going to be a march there next Saturday, and if people want to do that. Other thing I want to say is that people not from the community used to ask me how they could help, and I would say there's going to be a hearing at City Hall to block a certain thing. Just come in and say they would never put that facility in my community. That's all we need you to do. I don't remember anyone ever taking me up on that, but that's the kind of solidarity that can help. In terms of making clean energy accessible to the community, I can't answer that. Can any of you guys?
Well, so I guess we came here to talk, so we might as well talk, guys. Okay. So there are some EJ efforts around the country that I know of that are trying to make renewable energy efficiency accessible to EJ communities. I know some in Detroit, New York. I know some of those efforts in Detroit, New York, Minneapolis. In New Jersey EJ Alliance has a worker training program for wind power. So, the EJ community can enter into that. Now, here's where, since I'm here, and I want to open up this discussion anyway, we talked about it later in the afternoon. Historically, the EJ community, we're a nationwide grassroots movement led largely by people of color, but we're well integrated because EJ includes low-income white communities also, but usually smaller organizations that are not well resourced. Less than 5% of the money that goes to work on environmental issues from foundations, less than 5% goes to EJ groups. And more money goes to environmental groups to work on EJ issues than goes to environmental justice groups. Now you can imagine that drives us a little crazy, right? And so we don't have the capacity, a lot of times, we're getting new capacity, young people like Brooke, right? I mean, Cynthia and I have been working on this for a long time. With young people like Brooke, it's getting better. But to be honest, we still haven't had the capacity to work on renewable energy and energy efficiency issues in New Jersey like we want to. We did participate, there's a community solar program. And we did participate, we put in comments and tried to help shape that program, but we haven't had the capacity to keep working on it in the way we want to. And here's the conundrum. And here's the conundrum for us. There are other people working on those issues in New Jersey and working on equity issues and energy efficiency and renewable energy. And we think that's good, but on the other hand, we don't know what the hell's going on there. So are they taking positions, and they're because we are, Brooke and I and Cynthia are accountable to the grassroots EJ movement, right? So the positions we take are consistent with that movement. And people will pull my coattails. You know, if I go to meetings, people will say, Nikki, what are you all doing in New Jersey? What position are you taking? You know, but the people now doing equity and energy efficiency, renewable energy, are now accountable to that EJ movement. So it makes us nervous. So on the one hand, we're glad they're doing it, but on the other hand, we're also nervous, right? So that's a conundrum that we have to address. I mean, we've been talking about it, and you know, saying, well, do we have enough resources to address those issues? And people have been asking us to do it. It's not like people haven't wanted us to do it. You know, it's not like people have excluded us, but we just haven't had the resources to go there yet. So, you know, we're still discussing that internally, deciding of the resource we have. Do we need to devote some to that? Can we get more resources so that we can have a person, you know, dedicated to that? But those are the kind of issues, and it's not just in renewable energy and energy efficiency. You know, there are other issues that we'd like to address that we just don't have the resources to address. And so that's you know, it's getting better, but that's been an ongoing problem, and we're still working on that.
Thanks for the question. So I wanted to lift up one thing that Cynthia said at the end, which is one more action that folks can take in this moment, which is the march, the big march for clean air, Marcha por el Aire Limpio, which is next Saturday, April 20th, at noon at Down Bottom Farms in Newark. This is in the Ironbound community. This action is calling on the Passaic Valley Sewerage Commission to cancel its plans to build what would be the 4th gas-fired power plant in Newark's Ironbound community. We have someone from the Ironbound Community Corporation here who's going to be co-leading. This is Chloe, who's going to be co-leading one of the workshops this afternoon. So if you're interested in learning more about that fight, join Chloe's workshop, which is the Front Lines workshop. But everyone, please come out next Saturday, April 20th, noon, Newark, New Jersey, at Down Bottom Farms, Newark. There are yellow flyers. Our North Jersey organizer, Sam DeFalco, has a stack of them. If you'd like an extra flyer, please see Sam. But with that being said, let's give one more big round of applause for our incredible panel. And if you're like me, you can smell lunch, but we've got one last thing to do before then, so I'm going to hand it back over to Charlie. Sorry, one last thing. This is actually good because there's 3 actions. Workers' Memorial Day, the March for Clean Air, and this is a 3rd action, which we'll talk about a little bit more in detail later, but it is clear that all roads lead to organizing. If we are to take on the fossil fuel industry, if we are to take on organized capital and win a just transition off of fossil fuels, we need to grow our movement. One of the most important ways that we do that is to go into our communities and have conversations with people about the work that we're doing, taking lessons that we learn from these spaces and sharing them with community members. We are launching an ambitious community outreach drive this spring, starting with Earth Day and Earth Week, where nearly every community in New Jersey has some kind of environmentally themed event. And we're working to put us at each of these events with materials, with a petition, with leaflets, so that we can have these conversations and grow our movement and recruit new leaders and activists to build our power to win. So quick show of hands, who is willing to join just one event this spring where you can bring materials, including a petition, or if you aren't willing to join an event, even just talking and getting 10 of your friends or members of your communities to sign on to a petition, quickly raise your hands. Amazing. I think it's almost everyone in the room has a hand raised. That is absolutely fantastic. We need you. We need to grow this movement, and we're going to do it together when we leave here today. Our fantastic new organizer in New Jersey, John Asprey, with the green folders and clipboards, is going to be here. If you raise your hand, please see John, give him your name so that we can follow up with you, get you a packet of materials that you need to have these conversations, and if you're interested, we can plug you into one of the dozens of events that are happening starting next week, which is an excellent opportunity to talk to people who are, like-minded and thinking about environmental issues. So please, if you raise your hand, see John before you leave to get plugged in. And now I'm going to pass it over and back to Charlie.
Thank you. Give it up for the panelists and Mr. Smith. I am looking out at an amazing group of people, and I don't want us to ever forget this moment. So if we can, let's gather at the front and take a group photo. Gather up here.
Actually, if folks that are there...
Okay, stay there. Sorry, stay there. Sorry.
Stay there. We'll get you a sign. But do
Okay,
do
so we
stand
want,
up.
yeah, we do want folks standing, and we've got some great signs with messages like off fossil fuels, and we're going to hand those out. So if everybody can just grab a sign and pose, give your best smile. We're going to take a bunch of pictures really quickly, and then we've got a delicious lunch for you. So please stay tuned for the next update.